The story has its origins in Jingyang County, Shaanxi Province. This county has an ancient past associated with the Jin Kingdom, one of the 7 powers of the Warring States period. At the healer's hospital, the healer examining the elder noticed that the tumor he had was continuing to grow. Then he asked how his head was. The elder replied that it hurt worse than before, but that he could bear it for the time being. Taking a sip of tea from his cup, he said he'd better tell the doctor, instead of everything, honestly how much time he had left. The man lowered his head and said that his key was supporting the vessels for now, but soon there would come a pain that would make him lose his mind, and one day, he wouldn't wake up. After listening to him, the elder went outside and said that he saw that there was no point in further treatment, so he thanked the healer for all he had done for him. Without letting him answer, he turned around to leave and said one last time that while he was still alive, he would invite the healer to dinner at the Liu family's house. Looking after him, the healer mentally asked him to take care of his health and not to leave things to chance. Walking under the blossoming sakura trees, the elder decided to remember his life's journey. He also decided that he had to finish his business. He devoted his entire life to building and maintaining their family. The Liu family was his main goal and raison d'être. He raised his children, cared for and trained each of them. His precious family will now be led by his son and carried on by his grandchildren. They will follow his example and teachings and keep his legacy alive. And he has no regrets. His only regret is that he won't get to see his granddaughter Saul grow up. She is an unusual girl who has a body that is immune to aging and decay, that knows no pain or death. A talented child who will bring greatness and fame to their family. As the elder approached the estate gate, he immediately felt the piercing smell of blood and death that was spread in the air. His heart beat faster and fear appeared in his eyes. He realized that a terrible tragedy had happened here, and he didn't want to go inside. People began to gather quickly outside the manor, wondering what was going on there, and why did it happen exactly when the patriarch left the house. Ignoring the crowd that had gathered, the elder, with loud shouts demanding to be let through, forced his way inside. Ignoring whoever had called out to him, the elder stared at the picture in front of him in shock. The elder could not take his eyes off the bloody scene that appeared before him throughout the entire manor. He felt his soul tremble with horror that someone could do such a thing. The picture of murder and destruction was horrible. All over the estate lay the bodies of murdered people. Some of them had been mutilated, decapitated, or dismembered. Passing by the corpses of murdered servants and relatives, he was horrified to recognize them, and called them by name, asking who could have done such a thing and what had happened there. Suddenly he found the corpse of his daughter-in-law among the corpses, and helplessly knelt down and called out to her, hoping that she would answer. However, everything was meaningless. All the members of his family and estate had been killed, and he himself did not realize who could have committed such an atrocity. The elder bowed his head and burst into tears. He realized that in an instant he had lost everything he held dear. The people who had gathered began to discuss what had happened. It was a nightmare, and the Liu family had never had any enemies, so who could have done this? The elder, crushed with pain, saw no point in living any longer and put the knife to his throat. He did not pay attention to the cries of the people who asked him to stop. They ran in his direction hoping to stop him and begged him not to do it. After all, if he did, who would avenge his family? He had not stopped, but now he thought for a moment. He couldn't understand why they were saying that. Don't they know that an infirm old man can't take revenge on anyone? And even if he does, it's useless. It's better if he takes his life and goes to his family right now. Suddenly, a child's cry he heard from somewhere made him stop and drop the knife from his hands. Running over to the pot from which the crying was coming, he opened the lid and stood looking into it in surprise. The child lying in it did not stop crying, and seeing who was winging the lid burst into tears even more. Calling her by name, the elder cried again, unable to believe his eyes. As he pulled her out of there, he inwardly rejoiced at the fact that she, Saul, was alive, and unharmed too. Without wasting time, he rushed into the house with the girl in his arms. Surely it was all done by those who wanted to exterminate their family. They would definitely go back there when they found out that the girl was alive. People also rejoiced at the news that the youngest granddaughter was alive. Apparently her mother had managed to hide her before her death. While they were discussing this, the door to the house opened again and an elder stepped out. And then he addressed the crowd, saying that he had one last request for them. He asked them to bury his family. He would like to do it himself, but he has to leave. And before all the people in the heavens, he swears that before he stains the sacred spear of the family with the blood of the enemies who slayed them, he is not going to die. To himself, looking at the picture that spread before him, and biting his lips with bitterness and pain, he did not stop repeating their names and apologizing to them. After a while, he was traveling fast with his granddaughter on his back through the woods, already far from his estate. The elder hadn't used the art of body relief for a couple of decades. He hadn't needed it in all that time. Now, even though his granddaughter was clearly enjoying everything, every cell in his aching body was screaming in pain. But all he could do was try to ignore it, because either way they had to survive. Suddenly, in front of his pain-clenched eyes, a blade appeared and was approaching him with great speed. The elder opened his eyes sharply and deflected at the last moment from the sharp blade in the assassin's hands that flashed over his chest. Dodging another blow, he finally realized that he had been ambushed. Avoiding being kicked, he began to watch him. The assassin, however, was fast. However, at the same time, he had rather primitive movements. The elder realized he had a long way to go, so he decided he needed to deal with him as quickly as possible, and then he prepared to kick the unexpecting assassin in the face. He in turn quickly ducked and covered his face with his hands, intending to block the blow. However, when no blow came, he stared in amazement at the old man, who slumped to the ground holding his back and shivering in pain. Sensing the assassin's approach, the elder thought about the fact that he seemed to hear his spine break in his attempts to strike. No wonder, his body was no longer able to withstand fighting techniques. Looking at the killer, he was just furious. If he were 10 years younger, this underachiever would be dead by now. But now he had to protect Saul at all costs. Throwing himself forward under the surprised gaze of the assassin, the elder thought that if the assassin's cronies caught up with him, then things would be bad. After a moment's silent astonishment, the murderer took a firmer grip on his knife and rushed after the old man. Without turning around to see the man running after him, the elder ran with all his might, literally feeling his bones cracking. Turning back, he asked the assassin that although he was a mercenary, was there nothing human about him? How could he even go after an old man and a newborn child? Instead of answering, a blade flew towards the elder, which he barely dodged. That murderer was just an unscrupulous bastard by the looks of it. The elder himself can no longer escape, so there is only one way out. And if he doesn't take down the killer approaching him at breakneck speed, both he and his granddaughter are finished. So he drew his spear and turned and swung it towards the assassin. In any case, he had only one chance now. Noticing him pointing his spear in his direction, the assassin quickly jumped upwards, moving out of the path of the blow. To his surprise, however, the old man put the spear away and lifting his head up began to draw more air into his lungs. And without wasting time, he began to forcefully release air towards the assassin, activating the lion roar skill. From the strength of his skill, the assassin lost his bearings in space and dropped all the weapons he had in his hands. At this time, the elder once again took out his spear and began to unwind it, using the Liu family's secret technique and hurling it towards the assassin. He couldn't react in time, and the spear pierced his body with great speed, piercing through him. He felt a sharp pain and horror as the spear carried him away, nailing him to the tree trunk. The elder bent over and rested his knees on his knees, trying to catch his breath, and never ceasing to stare tensely in the direction of the assassin. After a while he, breathing heavily, at last approached the tree to which the murderer's corpse was nailed, and quickly approached him and punched him in the face, reminding him that I told him to stop following him, and he's just a punk-ass punk. Taking off his mask, the elder remarked that he did not know the fiend, but in that case he should find out about the one who sent him, though he would not answer his questions. From the looks of it, that dragon tattoo will be the only thing he gets from this killer. When he heard his granddaughter crying, he turned to her and said with a smile that she must have been very frightened, but she need not be afraid. After all, from now on her grandfather will protect her and be her trusted protector from any dangers that may come her way in life. Hearing him, the girl had stopped crying and now laughed joyfully. After a while, when it was getting dark, the elder decided to stop for the night and feed his granddaughter, who had not eaten anything all day. Looking at the boiling mass in the cauldron, he told the girl that she must be hungry, but she should wait a little longer. He stole some cow's milk and cooking utensils from a village that got in the way, and he never stole in his life. Truly, his old age is sad. With a smile on his face, he handed the girl a bowl of milk and said that he had already boiled it, so it was safe to drink. Looking at the way she ate, he kept saying that she should eat more, and she was good. After a while, she finished everything and licked her belly with a smile. The elder looked at her and smiled and rubbed her head. He thought to himself that he would really do anything for her. Without warning, he felt his brain being torn apart by a sharp and unbearable pain that made him let out a piercing scream. He clutched his head with his hands, trying to ease his distress, but it wasn't helping. Apparently, it was a tumor, and he'd never been in so much pain before. The elder couldn't stop holding his head and shouting loudly, unable to ease his pain. The healer had already told him that soon would come the kind of pain that would make him lose his mind, and one day, he just wouldn't wake up. He felt the life drain out of him as he watched his beloved granddaughter crying in despair, try to crawl to him to help him. The elder remembered how the healer had urged him to bring a pouch of mysterious pills with him, in case he got worse while traveling. He did not pay attention to the elder who said that medicines were already powerless against his illness. The healer explained that the pouch contained a rare poison that could irritate the nervous system and cause severe pain, and said that he should use this poison to fight the other poison that was eating him up from the inside. In his opinion, that it could suppress his tumor and prolong his life for at least a few days. The healer said he should take it just in case he wanted to continue living. The elder reached into his pockets, which were hidden in the folds of his old and tattered clothes, and realized that he was already losing consciousness. And he knew of the poison that was his last hope. It is used to torture prisoners. The poison causes terrible pain without killing a person. Even a strong martial artist would feel the pain as if his body was being torn to pieces. The elder, holding the pouch of poison in his hand, could not decide what to do. He knew that if he did not take the poison, he would simply die from the unbearable pain his tumor was causing. At that moment, his head was again struck by a searing and agonizing pain, which wrenched another desperate cry from him. He could not believe that such suffering could be repeated, and tried to restrain his cries. With trembling hands trying to put the poison in his mouth, he thought of no way he should die, and no way he should leave Saul alone. Before he could even taste it, he had already swallowed it, but immediately he was overcome with horror as he realized everything. This was not just poison, but the most deadly and destructive key that could destroy him from the inside out. The elder grimaced at the pain that kept him in pain. He searched for some way to relieve his agony, and the only thing he could think of was to grab his hair and pull it with all his might. But it was no use. The pain did not diminish but only intensified. When he opened his eyes, the dark haze of night had given way today, and the sun was illuminating everything around him. The elder didn't realize how much time had passed since he had passed out, but fortunately, the poisonous key had dissipated. He realized that this was a miracle, as was the fact that after all that had happened, he was, so far, alive. But he didn't know when the headache would start again, and he wouldn't be able to survive indefinitely after being poisoned by the poisonous key from this poison. However, Liu Jinshan must live to keep Saul safe from everything. He must make his body so that it can heal the tumor and protect Saul from harm. That's where body remodeling could help, rebuilding the bones and muscular frame so that the body would be better suited to martial arts. However, to do so, he would need to unlock the Muladraha and Sankasrara, and for that, one would need an amount of chi of 180 years. He had a huge amount of chi, which corresponded to the age of 150 years. But it was of little use to him when his body was so weak and frail. He could not display his full strength with such an unfit physical shell. Meditating, he put his clothes back on and thought, if he trained, it would take years, maybe more. Though he had once talked about not regretting anything, he now had a new goal. He was now Liu Jinshan, Liu Sol's grandfather, and he could not afford to surrender to death. He had to live for his granddaughter, for his family, for his honor. And now he couldn't let his life end so easily and irrevocably. Liu Jinshan, after traveling a long and arduous journey, finally reached a small village where he hoped he could find something to eat and rest. He remembered how he'd had to survive on the roots he'd plucked from the forest for the past 2 days and felt happy. He turned to the girl who was sitting on his back and asked with a smile if she was hungry, and he said that they had already arrived at the village and would soon have a hearty lunch. Turning around, he frowned as he smelled something, and he was already guessing what that smell was. There was a large pot on the fire from which an appetizing aroma was rising. In it, a thick and hearty goulash was boiling, to which whole chicken carcasses had been added. The people who were sitting around the pot were discussing the dish, talking about what they say that even a poor man has joyful days. At last, each of them would get a chicken, and it had been a long time since they had eaten. Hearing someone speak thoughtfully about the aroma coming from the pot, people turned in his direction in surprise. One of them stared at him and asked him without interest who he even was. The elder took off his hat, and with a friendly smile said he was just a hungry traveler. At the same time, he was not without surprise to note that these people, all of them without exception, belonged to the beggar sect. Judging from the knots on their belts, one is a rank 1 apprentice and the other 2 are rank 2 apprentices. Not only would he eat well, but he would also get valuable information from them. The elder smiled again and asked them if kind people like them would share a bowl of soup with the old man. One of them replied that he had never thought he would live to see a time when someone would take a bite of their poor food. The second supported him, asking if he had no conscience at all about robbing beggars. The third quickly shut his mouth and invited the old man to sit with them. He noticed that the people of the beggar sect were not miserly. As he sat down in the seat they offered him, the old man said that he thanked them, and that he had great respect for the sect of beggars, and they could be trusted. The man scratched his head and said that he had forgotten to add salt. Taking his mates with him, he asked the old man to wait for them for a while and they would bring the salt. He replied with a smile that they could take their time, and looking at the dish he mumbled approvingly, guessing what was really going on. Meanwhile, the people from the beggar sect began to discuss who he was. Judging from the fact that he was wearing expensive robes, their leader was sure that he was Liu Jinshan from the Liu family. And so he offers to capture him and hand him over to the people who are looking for him. When asked by one of them if they could do it, for he had been very strong in his time, the leader replied that they should not be afraid, for he realized at a glance that he was now just a bag of bones. Clutching the bamboo cane tighter, he said that they should just pile in all together at his command. When he came out to the old man, the head scratched his head and said with an awkward smile that it seemed they had already put all the salt in the soup, and there was something wrong with his memory. And at the same instant opened his eyes in surprise, looking towards the old man who asked that this was it. The elder couldn't contain his amusement and clutched his stomach as he felt full of delicious food. Then he said that they had salted the dish perfectly. When he asked him if he had eaten everything himself, he replied that Saul had liked the broth too, so they had a great meal together. Turning in his direction, the elder muttered grimly that maybe he was eating so well because he had found the scum who were connected to his family's murderers. After these words, the ringleader was frightened. If he had heard them, he had the hearing of a wolf. Having regained his composure in an instant, the ringleader ordered his comrades to attack him, and they immediately obeyed. One of them, who approached the fastest, swung a bamboo stick at the old man and shouted loudly that he would simply send him to the underworld. However, the elder didn't move an inch, and only set up his spoon to deflect his blow. From the force of the recoil, the bone in his attacker's arm flew out of place, and he yelled loudly, letting go of the stick. The second attacker brought his stick over the head of the elder, who once again didn't even flinch even as he shouted that he was just a damned old man. The next instant he froze, finding himself struck by some object, and then he fell backwards, looking shocked at the spoon that had landed on his forehead. Their leader also decided to try his luck, and quickly approaching the elder from behind, swung his stick at him, shouting loudly for him to die already. The elder only calmly raised his hand and easily blocked the blow, causing the stick to break in two against his hand. He quickly turned his attention to the other attacker who was trying to hit him. He wasted no time in squeezing his throat with his other hand. Raising him above him, the elder told him to speak only the truth. Then he asked if the beggar sect had sent him. Ignoring his pleas for mercy, he continued to ask if the beggar sect was connected to the murder of his family. Finally angry, not hearing a reply, the elder said he didn't care who he was. If he did not speak, he would be torn with his bare hands. One of the attackers immediately shouted that he shouldn't blame them. After all, they were not related to those who attacked the Liu family at all. They just wanted to hand him over to the Alliance because he was a wanted man. The elder turned his head in his direction and asked grimly what alliance, and why the man said he was a wanted man. The guy with his arm twisted outward, pulled a sheet from behind his sinus and held it out to him, asking to see what it said. It really turned out to be a wanted ad that said that Liu Jinshan, the patriarch of the recently exterminated Liu family, had lost his mind due to a state of spoilt qi. Therefore, the Murayama Alliance, asks all those who have found this man to arrest him and hand him over to the authorities, as he is insane and killing innocents. The elder, after reading this, clutched the paper with anger. He didn't understand why the Murayama Alliance had suddenly issued such a slanderous decree. If one wanted to know the history of the destruction of Liu's house, he should have asked the people of Jingyang. They were the only ones who could give complete and accurate information about this event. But the fact that a decree was issued for his arrest says only one thing: that somehow the Murayama Alliance had something to do with the murder of his family. Perhaps some powerful person hiding behind closed doors is controlling the Alliance leadership and their actions, using his power and influence to manipulate them and make them do what he wants. The elder tensed his muscles harder, deciding that in that case his enemy might be the Murayama Alliance. Even if he dedicates the next 5 years to building his body, it's like trying to break a rock with a stone. With these thoughts, he slapped the palm of his hand on the huge rock in front of him. Nevertheless, he must endure it all. If he finds proof that it was the Murayama Alliance that killed his family, he will smash that rock no matter what the cost. Even if, to do so, he would have to break that rock into millions or 10 million pieces. With these thoughts, he kicked more air into his lungs and used the Liu family's technique, a tribute of heaven and earth. Gaining more energy, he placed his palm against the rock again and this time shattered it, letting the power flow through it. And really, there's only one question on his mind. How is it that the Murayama Alliance, consisting of virtuous followers of traditional Buddhism, could do such a thing? Hearing his granddaughter crying, the elder turned to her in surprise and called her by name, asking if she was hungry. He reminded her that he had already given her milk, but seeing how reluctant the girl was to eat it, the elder wondered if she wanted it at all. Saul grimaced in response and threw the cup in front of her, and the elder, startled by this, barely managed to catch the cup full of milk before it spilled onto the ground. Handing her the cup once more with a smile, the elder said that she had almost spilled the milk, and she needed to drink it to grow and become big. The girl said nothing in reply, and tapped the cup again with the palm of her hand. The elder thought she had the same temper as her father. And then he smiled again and showed her his skewer, which he held in his hand, and then asked if she would like to try his rabbit kebab that he had prepared for himself. This time the girl stared at him mesmerized, unable to say a word, but showing with her whole look that she really wanted to. Looking at this, the elder took the skewer away from her, and ignoring her crying asked how she was going to eat if her teeth were not all erupted yet. Laughing, he came up with a brilliant idea. He said that if the girl was hungry, she should call him Grandpa, and then he repeated the same thing in syllables. Without looking at him, and looking only at the kebab in his hands, which so tempted her, the girl immediately repeated in syllables what he said and called him grandfather. Clearly not believing what he heard, the elder excitedly asked her to repeat what she said. The girl now repeated her words more confidently and began to call him grandfather relentlessly. Looking at it, the elder couldn't believe his eyes. It was incredible she was already talking, this child, growing by leaps and bounds. Covering his eyes and folding his arms across his chest, he shook his head with a smile, still thinking that this was all just amazing. Listening to her call him relentlessly, the elder said that he couldn't give her meat yet anyway, so they should go look for something to make her porridge. After some time, he, together with his granddaughter, reached some village that met him on the way. The elder decided to cover his face better with his hat. He didn't know how widespread the order to arrest him was, but it was best to avoid being seen by the martial artists. Suddenly, a woman caught his eye, which made the elder immediately think that it was a great fortune that they had met an ordinary woman. Pulling his hat back on, he called out to her, apologizing for disturbing her. The girl asked fearfully who he was. The man did not answer the question, and said only that his child needed porridge, and asked if the woman had some groats. Hearing the old man say that she had not eaten for several days, the woman bent over with regret, and looking at the girl said it was a misfortune that such a babe had nothing to eat. The woman offered to breastfeed the girl, to which the old man happily agreed, asking if it was really okay. She took the girl in her arms and said that of course she could. Babies need milk to grow after all. The elder thanked her immediately. And the woman in turn asked with a smile if he could turn away, and the old man with an awkward cough immediately did so, saying that of course he could. With his head down, he began to talk about how they had finally had the chance to meet a kind soul like her at such an hour. His granddaughter had not even been able to feed on her mother's milk before she learnt to eat on her own. and he doesn't want to steal milk from people to feed her anymore. After a little while, he asked how his granddaughter was doing and if she was eating well. When he didn't hear a reply, he sensed something wrong and called out to her again to see if everything was all right. When there was no reply, the elder turned round and, seeing the woman running away with the girl, called her mad and asked loudly what such a damned as she was doing in the first place. The woman paid no attention to him and only repeated to herself that she would be rich. In the next instant, the elder caught up to her and forcefully slapped his palm on her back, thus robbing her of her senses. The woman immediately fell to the ground, releasing the girl from her arms, who apparently didn't even realize what had happened. Catching his granddaughter with one hand, he pulled out a spear with the other and caught the woman with the end of it. And then, calling her a shameless woman, he wanted to ask why she wanted to steal his granddaughter, but he stopped short. His eyes fell on a stand with some notices on it. When he looked and read them, the elder could not believe that even in this backwater, there were orders for his arrest. And next to the order for his arrest, there was another one. It said that the mad Liu Jinshan had kidnapped the newborn baby girl he was carrying, and whoever rescues this girl and delivers her to the Murayama Alliance will be rewarded handsomely, a reward promised by the Murayama Alliance itself. The elder was horrified. This was utter nonsense, and who in the Murayama Alliance could possibly need Saul? And why had they started all this? Hearing some voices, the elder concluded that it wasn't only the warriors that he should be wary of. Their portraits were probably already hanging all over Shanxi province. Therefore, he should hide. People passing by were discussing that now these arrest orders are everywhere, and they just don't understand what's going on and who they should believe. One of them came to the booth and looked at the ads and said that he had heard that the Lius were a respected family. It would be better for the old man to live out his life in peace than to go mad. As he listened to him, the elder thought about the fact that all his life he had tried to do the honorable thing. As a result, he would never have thought that in the last years of his life he would be wandering and shunning people. Meanwhile, those people changed the subject and began to discuss the fact that not so long ago, the great Bok family living nearby had also been slaughtered. They say they were all killed in one night. The elder thought about it for a moment. The great Buk family were more numerous than the Liu family, and they had just as many great warriors. At this point, one of the people said that what was strange about all this was that the bodies of the children were never found, and people said that they saw the villains taking the children away with them. The elder immediately realized that this was no mere coincidence. They must be the same villains who had killed his kin. Also, not everyone can slaughter a family of great warriors like Buk in one night. But if the Murayama Alliance is really behind this, he doesn't understand why. Suddenly, the girl caught his attention and started calling out loudly. Liu Jinshan was pierced by a realization. When she was first born, people only talked about her, that the daughter of the Liu family was born with a body of immortal integrity. He recalled that at that time, the Murayama Alliance sent them a miraculous elixir to strengthen Qi Soul. They conveyed the words to them that for all of Jianggu, it was a great joy that a girl with the same body constitution as the Empress of Swords, the greatest martial arts expert, had been born. It also meant that the Murayama Alliance was well aware of his granddaughter, and it turns out that the goal of these scumbags was to exterminate all the adult members of their family. Terror came over him along with the realization that it was all done because they wanted to get Saul for themselves. Clenching his teeth forcefully, he thought that they were just damned scum. Even if he really got the spoiling qi and became insane, he would still kill them all. At that moment, one of the people he met on the road noticed him and said that of course he couldn't have gone far with a child in his arms. Watching him, these men laughed at the elder, saying that he had left them alive for nothing, because now they had the best assassin in the land with them. The assassin behind them said that as agreed, he would lead them to the alliance himself. The men immediately replied, of course, it would be as he wished. He thought to himself that his luck had finally run out. It was hard to believe that he could become famous so easily and quickly. After a moment, turning to where the elder stood, he was surprised to find that he was not in that spot. While they were looking around trying to figure out where the old man and the child could have gone, he himself appeared behind them. The elder himself, from his anger, had become completely possessed by the spoiling qi, and he thought to himself that he would now, in any case, kill every single one of them. Hearing someone behind them say something, the people standing on the roof quickly turned around. They looked behind them in shock. But when they turned round, they saw no one, and now they were trying to understand what had happened, for they had all heard something. In the meantime, the elder took the child in his arms and tried to leave the village as quickly as possible, moving quickly and silently across the rooftops. He realized now with anger at himself that he had been unable to control his anger and had nearly had his chi tainted, and this was all very stupid. If he hadn't stopped at that moment, he would have turned into the madman that the villains of the Murayama Alliance paint him to be. He was about to sink completely into his musings, but suddenly he heard the voice of a girl who had made herself comfortable on his back and called out to him with confidence in her voice. Turning his head in her direction, the elder told her not to worry, and not to worry, for he would not allow such a thing to happen again. Looking into her eyes, he pronounced that she was indeed a good luck charm who, at the right moment, had saved her grandfather. Without stopping again, he ran quickly across the rooftops again, hoping he could get away without anyone chasing him. After finding out that the whole world was against him and Saul, he was just forced to find a place where no one would bother them. The forests and mountains were so desolate that even the wild animals were not afraid of them, feeling their power and superiority. It had been 2 whole months since everything had happened, and he had been forced to hide from the world with his granddaughter. When he came out on some lawn, the elder called to his granddaughter and asked her if she could see what he saw. The sleeping girl barely opened her eyes and, still sleepy, stared at the place her grandfather was talking about. The other one, meanwhile, was happily pointing his finger in front of him, saying that at last they had found what they were looking for. This hut in front of them looks just like a castle, and in their position, even better than a castle. When Liu Jinshan came closer, he looked around and noticed that there was even a vegetable garden near her. This was truly a good fortune for them. Quietly approaching the house, the elder opened the door and peeked inside. There was no devastation inside as there is in old houses, and considering that this house had been abandoned a long time ago, it was pretty clean inside. As he approached the crate in the corner, the elder also noticed that the furniture was still intact, not even rotted, and that was a very good thing. Suddenly noticing a lonely jade box standing alone, he happily grabbed it, hoping that this precious box would have some jewelry to sell. When he opened it, however, he was surprised to find only throwing needles inside. This made him think that a martial artist had probably once lived in this house. Raising his head, he saw a 7-stringed guqin hanging on the wall. In fact, guqin and throwing needles were a very rare combination, and it seems to him that apparently the former owner of this house was not an ordinary man at all. Before the sun disappeared over the horizon, the elder cleaned his house, and when darkness fell, he lit a fire in the cooker to warm his dwelling. And then, when he had prepared the food, he brought it to the girl with a smile, saying that the food was finally ready and it was time to eat. She immediately pulled her hands in his direction. And when he asked her if she was hungry, she immediately confirmed it, and then she looked hungrily at the spoon her grandfather was handing her. Looking at the way she was, Liu Jinshan couldn't stop praising her and giving her more, and he thought to himself that the girl was very spry. She was eating as well as his son had once done, and that was a very good thing. The elder himself has only practiced martial arts all his life, but now he realizes how hard it is to raise children, and that his daughters-in-law were busy from morning till night. Remembering those times, he immediately thought regretfully of how much he wished he could turn back the clock and praise them for such hard work. He had never once in his life imagined that he would ever lose that opportunity irrevocably. He was pulled out of his thoughts by the voice of a girl who asked him why he was crying. Thoth immediately stiffened with the outstretched spoon, actually feeling tears rolling down his face that he hadn't noticed before. After a moment, the elder quickly turned away and started asking back who else was crying, justifying it by saying that he just got smoke in his eyes while he was cooking. Unable to listen to the girl repeating that he was crying, Liu Jinshan quickly went out with the words that he had forgotten to extinguish the stove and would now quickly return. The girl did not budge and continued to stare at him in bewilderment until he was out of sight. Once outside, the elder immediately began to reproach himself for his weakness. It was a shame to him how he could ever appear so weak in front of her. He didn't understand what was happening to him, so he surmised that maybe he was just tired of their loitering and wanted to finally settle down somewhere. When he found out what all those villains from the Murayama Alliance were plotting to do to him, all he could think about was revenge. But now, revenge would have to wait. Now, and with that being the case, His main goal was to raise his granddaughter Saul healthy and strong. The next morning, the elder went out to inspect his new possessions. He noticed with some surprise that the land looked fertile and the well was in good order. So taking a hoe, he started digging in the ground with the words that here he was going to grow vegetables. And then he said that he would grow many different vegetables for Saul to eat. As he raised the hoe above his head again to strike, he felt an unpleasant crunch in his back, as if something had broken. The next instant, his whole body was pierced by an unpleasant pain that made him scream out, feeling sorry for his back. He immediately fell silent, however, when he was surprised to hear a child's voice from the side repeating everything he had said. His granddaughter had come to him, and now, already on her feet, was shouting loudly and holding her back, copying her grandfather. The one didn't pay any attention to it. Much more shocking to him was that Saul was standing up straight despite her small age. Lowering himself down, the elder began to call out to her with a smile, ignoring the pain in her back and suggesting she try to approach her grandfather. Saul immediately walked towards him, and just when she was close to him, she tripped and almost fell. But her grandfather caught her in time, saying that she was an incredible child. She was already walking and talking. Then with a smile, he put her on the ground, asking her if she wanted to play with her grandfather at home. The girl immediately happily agreed. Taking the girl by the hand, he led her back into the house, limping slightly and still holding his back. In the evening, the girl finally fell asleep, evidently exhausted from a hard day's work. Looking at her, the elder thought that she looked like a little bodhisattva in her sleep. Taking the spear standing in the corner, he decided that tomorrow, by all means, he would feed her meat, and for that, he would go hunting now. Throwing himself into the forest and running past the trees, the elder recalled the rules of hunting and that animals' senses are even more acute in the dark. He knew he could easily make his way through the forest and scour it, using his technique that made his body lighter. Suddenly, he noticed something and stopped. Judging by the tracks that were there was a big deer wandering around somewhere, and if he didn't deal with it, it might ruin his beds. So he decided he would follow his marks and footprints and find him, just as long as he didn't accidentally attract predators by the smell of blood. He lowered himself almost insensibly to the ground, straining his hearing to make out the sounds coming from the immediate surroundings. Then he stood up, seeing people in the distance. The elder could not understand where the people were coming from. He thought that there was no one else in these mountains but he and his granddaughter. Two of the men apparently came to the man who was expecting them, and Zem asked why they were late and what was wrong with their faces. Hearing him ask if they had collected tribute from the merchants, the elder immediately realized who they were, and this mountain was probably a haven for bandits. Meanwhile, the ringleader asked where everyone else was who was with those who had been sent to collect the tribute. One of them told in a trembling voice that the traders were traveling with guards, and those guards turned out to be warriors of the Wudang sect who were Taoist monks. Their head asked if he wanted to say that their men had been killed by these scum. The man replied that this was the case and apologized. And then he said that despite all this, they had managed to finish off one Taoist, and as he learnt, this Taoist was a second-generation disciple of the Wudang sect. His leader asked what happened to the other one, if they had only killed one. The man replied that he ran away with his tail between his legs when he saw reinforcements coming. Not sharing his amusement, the leader shouted loudly and angrily that they were just stupid. Even if they were stupid, they should have known to kill both of them. Listening to their leader wailing about how they were all finished, the elder thought that really, if they didn't want to be discovered, they should have killed all the witnesses. And since they killed not just anyone, but a monk of the Udon sect, punishers will be sent to them very soon, and just as soon there will be a massacre on this mountain. This mountain has somehow become his and his granddaughter's home, so now he must intervene before these bandits set them up. Hearing some rustling from the bushes behind him, the ringleader immediately turned around, peering into the darkness. And then he pulled out his sword, loudly asking what kind of rat was hiding there, and his subordinates, agreeing with him, demanded that the one hiding there should come out, or they would kill him. A man with a spear immediately appeared from the bushes, and asked who was talking to the elders like that and in that tone. And don't they want to say hello to their neighbor who recently moved in? The leader asked with a mocking smile if the grandfather had gone completely mad, and his assistant said that the grandfather had probably just been abandoned by the children in the forest. The elder was clearly not happy with such answers, but on the contrary became irritated, especially the fact that they began to discuss the fact that he was obviously crazy, and it was immediately obvious. Not wanting to stall any further, the leader called out to him loudly and told him that they were Black Sword Mountain bandits and this mountain was theirs. So if he didn't want to die a wrong death, he'd better get out of here. The elder laughingly asked how this mountain could be theirs if it belonged to nature and not humans. He became serious in a moment, and grimly told them to return to their leader and tell him that an old man had settled at the foot of the mountain, but they must not dare to go near the place, or he would bleed them all to death. Hearing him, the bandits pretended that the words frightened them into holy terror, and falling on their knees bowed their heads and began to naively beg forgiveness, and say that they would immediately convey to the ringleader his words. The next moment, however, the ringleader raised his head and asked menacingly if that was how he thought they would answer him. The elder, averting his gaze easily, said that he did not think so, but on the contrary, he knew perfectly well that they would not answer like that. The bandits were pissed off by this, and they began to draw their swords, annoyed that this grandfather was just playing a trick on them. One of them immediately pounced on him, offering to betray him to the very land he loved so much. The elder paid no attention to him, thinking that this would not do. If he wanted them not to come there again, he had to show them that he was as far away from them as the moon. And then lightly struck the blade of the sword approaching him with 2 fingers, which immediately shattered into pieces, and the shockwave threw the attacking host farther away in the opposite direction from the old man. In the next instant, the ringleader also lunged at the old man with his sword at the ready, confident that he would be lucky. And without wasting time on pointless talk, slashed it at the spot where the elder was standing. Dropping down behind him, he even felt sorry for the old man, saying that he wanted to be nice to him and make a deal somehow. But he still couldn't think in time. In the next instant, he realized with horror that the old man was behind him and he had done him no harm. The one in turn swung his hand, activating the Leo family's technique with words that actually wanted to say the same thing, and then stabbed him in the back, thus forcing the bandit at once with a loud scream to jump to his feet. The one continued to scream and squirm in pain, looking at which the elder irritably told him to stop pretending. The bandit immediately fell silent in surprise, straightening up but still holding onto his chest. Turning to the old man, he immediately rushed towards him, irritatedly asking if this grandfather was completely out of his mind. At this moment, the bandit standing behind him looked surprised at the huge footprint that appeared on the tree. The ringleader turned shockedly in that direction too, realizing that this trail had obviously appeared there for a reason. The elder, running swiftly round and round the bandits, left many such marks in the trees, and then eventually stood in front of them again, eyeing their reactions to the sold and fallen trees. They, meanwhile, didn't notice him at all, looking shocked at the whole thing happening in a matter of seconds. The elder, meanwhile, said sternly that he wanted to teach them manners, but since this was their first meeting this time, he would let them go, so they can get out. At this moment, another person who was simply gigantic in size appeared out of the mist, and he asked loudly what it meant that he was going to let them go, and did the mudslide come down or something like that. The elder laughed and said that from the look of it, the big fellow was clearly a man of good judgment, and knows some tricks. The one, meanwhile, let his words pass his ears and approached his subordinates, who called him the second ringleader with a question as to whether they were arguing with this old man. And quickly turning towards the elder, swung over his head with the words that he should not have argued, and without talking chopped him in 2 at once. The elder dodged and quickly approached him, once again activating the heaven and earth palm technique, but this time using the first technique. The axe flew past him easily and stuck into the ground just where he had been standing before. The elder himself swiftly punched the bandit in the chin, activating the technique of a death blow that left no trace. From this blow, the bandit flew far forward, unable to do anything or resist the old man in any way. Looking at his flying body, the other bandits were horrified at this outcome. This was their second leader, after all, and he was one of the strongest. The next moment, they turned towards the old man, no longer laughing or mocking him, and the old man in turn called them mockers, and he said grimly that he'd said before that they'd never get a second chance, so let them get the hell out of there, and don't let him see them again. In the next instant, the bandits watched with equal shock as the elder fell to his knees with a loud cry. The elder's head was once again pierced by an infernal pain that could not be tolerated. The elder didn't understand why it was happening to him now. Still watching him squirm in pain, holding his head, The bandits tried to figure out what it was that was happening to him there. Meanwhile, he had taken out the poison and was again trying to put it into his mouth. He realized that he must never faint. After all, his granddaughter was all alone at home. As he put something in his mouth and screamed even more, the bandits began to wonder what was going on and what he had actually eaten. While the elder was trying to deal with this horrible pain, they were discussing whether it was the elixir that irritated the nervous system. And if it was, then the elder was just sick. Why would he even eat such a thing? Paying no more attention to his condition, the ringleader said it was all unimportant and rushed towards him, saying that this was their only chance to kill the old man. Running up to him first, he kicked the elder in the face, calling him simply cursed. The second bandit ran up from behind and kicked him in the neck, asking how he even dared to attack the Black Sword Mountain bandits. The three of them started hitting and kicking the elder, who was covering his neck and head with his hands. They said that they would not let him die quickly, so he should prepare himself. Looking at it, he felt his eyes gradually closing and his consciousness leaving him. Although the elder realized that he must not lose consciousness, for his granddaughter was waiting for him home alone, his eyes would not listen and eventually closed completely. After a while, he began to gradually regain consciousness in an unknown place. While his eyes were still closed, he heard one of the bandits talking to his leader, who, after listening to the subordinate, punched him in the face, saying that he was just a jerk who didn't understand anything. He asked why he was hitting him and tried to justify himself with tears in his eyes, not realizing why. The ringleader clearly didn't like this, so once again he called him a dumbass moron and brought his hand over his face again, and then slapped him across the face with force, asking loudly if he had no brains at all, that he didn't even realize what he had done, and turning to the elder asked his subordinate why they had tied him up and tied him to a post in the first place. The elder, meanwhile, began to move a little, trying to see if he was alive, how much time had passed, and how his granddaughter, who was left all alone, was doing. Hearing the question of whether he was awake, the elder raised his head and stared angrily at the man in front of him, trying to see if it was their leader. Meanwhile, the chief left his subordinate and turned fully towards the elder, looking him straight in the eye and folding his hands in a respectful gesture. And then, without waiting for an answer to the question, the chief apologized for the behavior of their brats and, calling him an elder, said it would not happen again. The elder did not share his friendliness, and with his face visibly darkened after his words, he began to ponder why he had not killed him, but had let him live. The chief, holding his hands in front of him, asked the elder to let them apologize to him, and the elder, looking at this, thought that this bandit was very cunning. He had already guessed what he was getting at, and why he was actually being so friendly to him. But the elder would not fall for the tricks of a scum like them. He realized that he must return to Saul immediately. But these bandits have him so chained up that he can't break them. These chains could only be cut by a weapon charged with chi power. The chief respectfully bowed his head to him, saying that if he had realized they had such a chance, he would have come to greet him personally. So he apologized profusely. The elder replied that if he was sorry, he should let him go. The chief immediately listened to him and spoke loudly to his subordinate, asking why he was standing there and ordering him to bring the keys. The subordinate immediately gave them to him. Taking the keys, the chief addressed the elder with the words that he would remove the chains from his body, and then his subordinate would untie his hands. When he opened the lock, he asked the elder not to do anything stupid and to keep his anger under control. But as soon as the elder felt that the chains were no longer holding him, he immediately extended his leg and swung it at the bandit in front of him. The bandit barely had time to deflect the blow, but still flew backwards from the elder's force. This was what he had feared. This old man had incredible physical strength. In the meantime, the elder was trying to free his hands from the rest of the chains, and in doing so, he was pulling forward with such force that the pole to which he was tied began to bend in half. He was approached by another gang leader who raised an axe above his head and asked him threateningly if he was going to riot again. He struck the chain that held the elder's arm with his axe, and it shattered into pieces. He then lunged at the second ringleader and punched him hard in the stomach with his fist, causing him to fly far outside their camp. The elder followed him, leaving the camp just as quickly. He stepped on his face and pushed off to fly quickly away, ignoring the second ringleader who raised his hand and ordered his men to stop the elder, chase him down and kill him. The elder, flying past the bandits and their fortifications estimated their numbers. There seemed to be more of them than he had realized. The archers who were standing on the fortifications, upon hearing the question as to why they were not firing at the elder, hurriedly drew their weapons. The elder, seeing this, immediately covered himself with his hands, thinking that it would be very difficult for him to avoid all the arrows, and he might have to sacrifice his arm to protect himself. At the same time, the archers had already drawn their bows and took aim at the elder, waiting for the command to fire. At that moment, the leader shouted loudly for them to lower their bows and not to shoot, and let the elder be released. The elder calmly flew over the fence, realizing that no one would interrupt him, for the archers had already obeyed the order. Wasting no time, he immediately ran into the forest, hoping to reach the foot of the mountain as soon as possible, asking his granddaughter to wait a little longer, for her grandfather would be with her soon. The ringleader, still looking at the fences the elder had flown over, thought that he had amazing kung fu and was definitely a martial artist. Meanwhile, a second ringleader came up to the ringleader and, holding his face, asked why he had let the elder go in the first place. The second ringleader was furious. He was saying that it was likely that those of their boys who had died in the mountains had been killed by this old man. The ringleader shouted for him to shut up, and anyway, they had messed up, and he, as the one responsible for them, would now have to fix it. Now the fate of the mountain and the Black Sword Mountain gang depended on this old goat, and if he didn't help them, they would all be destroyed. The elder quickly made his way to the foot of the mountain, and running up to the house began calling to his granddaughter, saying that grandfather had finally returned. He didn't hear her answer, and that scared him very much. In fact, he just prayed that no animal would wander in there. However, in spite of everything, he continued to call out to her. At that moment, the little girl jumped out from around the corner, crying to her frightened grandfather, who called out to her again. He fell to his knees and immediately hugged her, telling her not to cry anymore, for her grandfather was with her now. When the girl was still crying, he said that such a little girl was left all alone, and asked if she was so badly frightened. Then he promised that he would never leave her again. To his surprise, the girl stopped crying and began to quack, and her grandfather immediately asked her why she was suddenly quacking. He raised it before him, and was surprised to realize that it was not his granddaughter who was croaking, but the frog she was holding in both hands. He patted her on the head and told her it was impossible, and then after asking how she caught the frog, he immediately said that she was very talented. Without removing the smile from his face, he suggested we go back to the house. After all, she must be very hungry. When he sensed someone approaching, the elder's face immediately darkened. Without even turning round, he realized who it might be. Turning to face the bandits, he covered his granddaughter with him, and told them sternly that he had warned them more than once to stay away from the foot of the mountain, and asked those standing in front of him if they really wanted him to see it through. The bandits did not answer a word, and only bowed before him, and began to beg his forgiveness, for they were very guilty before the elder. Looking at them, the elder was surprised to realize that these creeps were just apologizing, but still, he didn't want to deal with them anymore. So after saying that he understood, he told them to leave. At that moment, the chief appeared and brought the spear with the words that he had come to return the spear to the elder. He realized that it was dear to him and found it where the elder had fallen. He realizes that it will not be easy for the elder himself to survive in these mountains, plus he sees that he also has his granddaughter with him. So he thinks it is good for neighbors to help each other. The elder, to his surprise, did not fall for all these pretty words, and angrily asked him if he was thinking of telling him his teeth, and then took away the spear, saying that their days were numbered because they had killed a monk of the Udon sect, and apparently they want him, a martial artist, to use against the punishment coming at them, and to prevent it. Disregarding the change in the ringleader's face, the elder said that if they were thinking of deceiving him, it was better to let them go straight away. The leader listened to him and bowed his head respectfully, saying he understood. He apologized for his rudeness, and then said that if he ever needed anything, he could come to them any time. Placing some sack in front of him, he said that they had brought gifts to the elder to make amends. So humbly, they asked him to accept their gift. Without wasting any more of the elder's time, they quickly turned and left his courtyard. The elder, meanwhile, kept his gaze on them, still not trusting them very much. With one last glance at the departing people, the old man turned his attention to the bag, wondering what had been brought there. but to his amazement, he saw that his little granddaughter had already climbed into it. After pulling her out of there, he asked with a smile when she had managed to get there and climb in, since the elder himself hadn't even noticed it. Not immediately noticing that his granddaughter was holding a snake, the elder asked her why she was laughing so hard and what was so interesting in the bag. In the next instant, he quickly hit the snake on the head, taking its life with words that he didn't think those rascals had put the snake there. Of course he understood. It was good for the body to eat snakes, but how he could put a live snake in his bag he sincerely did not understand. But still, in addition to that in the pouch they brought meat and other edibles. They were not so rude after all by the looks of it. Sometime later, when night had fallen, he again heated the stove in the house, and now he and his granddaughter were sitting there. On the table were a few plates, an empty clay pot, and chopsticks. The elder leaned against the wall and laughingly asked when he had last eaten so much. Now then, it was time to move on. Saul, in turn, just mumbled something in agreement, lying on his leg. After a moment, he stood up, firmly saying that he so-and-so had no time to rest on his laurels, even if he really wanted to. As he sat up straight and began to meditate, the elder thought about the fact that an attack of pain could catch him unawares at any moment. He should do chi breathing exercises at every spare moment. He needed a total body rebuild anyway, and he needed a total body rebuild as soon as possible. He must keep himself under control, and only then will he succeed. He must now protect his granddaughter Saul and avenge his murdered family. When he finished meditating and opened his eyes, the elder looked at his little granddaughter sitting across from him with emotion. She had already fallen asleep but apparently sat up to repeat after him. The elder laughed and said so. He approached her from behind and said that it was better to train her to develop her energy from childhood. The child has fewer blocks on the meridians, so the effect of meditation is doubled. In the next instant, the elder, with the words that her grandfather would teach her, began to let his chi energy flow into her body. However, he felt that there was absolutely nothing interfering with his energy, which shocked him. He couldn't believe it just couldn't be. The girl had no blocks at all and no stagnant energy. Her vessels were open and the flow of energy was unimpeded. This meant that she was dozens of times faster at producing chi concentration. Since that was the case, she could already learn martial arts. That's what gives a body immortal integrity. Then perhaps we should increase the complexity already. In order to concentrate chi energy, you have to run it through the entire circulatory system back to the power center. It was unbelievable. She was able to concentrate a huge amount of chi. Even the fact that she had fallen asleep didn't bother her. In one round of energy, she gathered 20 times more than a normal person. Looking at her, the elder decided that perhaps that was where they would end up for the day. As he tucked her into bed, covering her with a blanket, he thought about how the Liu family's meditation method, the heaven and earth method, rested on the purity of the soul from vices and an unbending spirit. Gradually, this meditation method increases a person's ki reservoir, but the weakness of their method is that the result comes very quickly, unlike the methods of other big sects. But the innate giftedness of an already sleeping girl is simply designed to solve this problem quickly. After a while, he went outside. Sitting down on the porch, the elder said tiredly that he was having a hard time because he had little energy, and if he were a little younger, things would be different. He turned his head and stared at the bottle that had been brought to him with the rest of the food. The elder didn't know what was in it, but he had a hunch. He closed his eyes, coughed, and turned his head back regretfully. Then he said that ginseng wine and fried snake were good for energy, of course, but who do the bandits think he is? A little nagging that they think he is naive and will fall for their tricks, Liu Jinshan still put the snake to roast on the fire before cleaning it. He poured a full cup of wine and, disregarding his previous words, tipped it sharply into his mouth, drinking the contents to the drop. And then he took the skewer off the fire, already quite drunk. In fact, he couldn't remember how long it had been since he'd last drunk like that. But it felt amazing now. After drinking, the elder immediately took a savory bite from the snake on the spit, chewing it immediately, nibbling on the wine he had drunk. And finally, having finished everything and finished his drink, he had a full stomach and went to another place, thinking that it was all just fine, and the sensations were amazing, and the snake was a marvelous delicacy. The blue moon glittered in the sky, casting its bright light on everything around, including the cozy courtyard where a wise and venerable elder sat on the porch of the house. But now, Drunk as he was, the elder was thinking about how good it was to be alive. Even if you're knee-deep in muck, it's all the same. Life felt wonderful to him now. He closed his eyes and raised his head to the sky, where the full moon was still shining. It was as if he were asking her if he could have another glass of wine before he went to bed. Suddenly, before his eyes, a piece of the moon began to slowly break away from the main ball. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw a small piece of the moon, as if detached from a huge glowing ball, begin to slowly and imperceptibly glide across the sky. This substance slowly and smoothly descended towards the ground, leaving behind a strange glowing trail that looked like a snake. The elder watched as it suddenly began to pick up speed, and was now fast approaching down towards his dwelling. After a moment, the substance changed trajectory, and Sweat the man's drunken blank stare flew into the forest instead of crashing into the ground in front of him. For some reason, the elder's drunken mind thought it was a wandering light, and now he looked at the flying substance with naive wonder. After a moment, it was as if he was pierced by the realization that, in fact, he was just drunk. But that didn't bring him to his senses, and he still wanted to understand what that glowing, flying thing was. So without wasting any time, he rushed after it with glittering eyes, thinking only that he must see that wandering light as soon as possible. The elder did not realize what was happening, and as if possessed by that fire and light, ran after it deep into the forest. He had only heard about what he had seen and found instead of this light in fairy tales, and that was in his distant childhood. This picture finally sobered him up. Smoky blue fur, it was that of a beast that had already killed over 1,000 people in the last 1,200 years. It was undoubtedly a blue-eyed man-eating wolf, and this huge mythical beast was now, right in front of him, devouring his recently caught prey, which was apparently a man. The elder barely had time to hide behind the bushes before the beast spotted him. He still couldn't believe what he was seeing. It couldn't be. There was no way a monster from the Shanxi legends could be in the Yanzhou Mountains. But now, as much as he didn't want to, he would have to choose to take Saul immediately and run away from there and not come any closer. Or muster up all your willpower and kill the man-eating beast at any cost, and thus remain there. As the elder sat there, thinking about what he should do, the blue-eyed ogre wolf had come up behind him and was staring at him bloodily, ignoring the blood dripping from his previous victim's mouth.